I was trying to remember when I first met you, and it's through the International Times.
Yes.
And I think had you been involved with East Village Other in New York?
I was their Paris correspondent.
I thought so. Yeah. I mean, what happened was in New York there was the Village Voice, which was the great sort of liberal arts paper, politically left paper that Norman Mailer and a whole bunch of other people started, and there was a newspaper strike in New York, and a bunch of guys, Walter Boart and Alex Katzman, and a few other people decided to start their own alternative. So instead of
the
Village Voice, they called it the East Village Other, because they came from the East Village, which was much more of a slum. And
that was John Wilcox.
John Wilcox,
Australian.
He's English.
English?
He came from Manchester.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry. He's still around, you know.
Yes, he lives in
Orange County.
Yes, in
California.
OJ, California.
Right.
Yes, Orange Juice, California. Anyway, they wanted foreign correspondents, and there were a set of sort of people. I was the London correspondent, and Jean-Jacques was the Paris correspondent, and Simon Winkelhoch was the Amsterdam correspondent.
Right.
And and that was in the, I guess, early '66 or maybe late '65.
Yeah.
And then in
you had Indica then?
we started Indica in September '65.
Oh, because I visited that.
Yeah.
I met you there.
That's right.
You and John.
That's right.
Right, and then, but we just talked a little bit. We didn't become friends.
No,
we became friends later. Right.
But that was part of a sort of underground conspiracy sort of thing. Because when we started
tribal network,
when we started International Times, we had the same people. Simon Winkelhoch was the Amsterdam correspondent, and in that case we had John Wilcox wrote some things from New York, and so did Walter Boart and all this. So the three papers really. The East Village Other and the International Times, and then later on stuff that was coming out of Amsterdam. It was the same sort of group of sort of post-beatniks, I suppose. Well, you're more the actual beatnik.
Well, yeah.
So I'm a bit younger, not too much, but a little bit. I was living in a communal apartment in London, or staying there. I would hitchhike up from art college, and it was one of those. This is in the early '60s, and I remember one day a guy called Peter Wallen, who's a filmmaker and later on the head of the film school at UCLA. I remember one day he came down. We were all sitting around, and he said, "This is such a cool pad, man. There's always a fresh copy of Naked Lunch on the coffee table." And in those days, you had to smuggle Naked Lunch in from Paris because it wasn't published in England yet.
Or in America,
even in the early '60s. So you had to put it down the back of your shirt, And so, to begin with, I mean, the book already had this great aura of sort of, it was so cool and it was banned and all the rest of it. And then there was the story of Burroughs himself, this junkie who killed his wife, and he was, all this. And then what we used to do is we'd sit around and smoke dope, and people would read aloud from Naked Lunch and just collapse with laughter and stuff. So he was part of the sort of my early. I mean, I was a teenager then. It was just amazing. And later on, of course, I met him and got to know him, and then realised there was some very interesting political ideas there, and that he was more than just a writer who was like really shocking and outrageous, and who challenged every idea that you'd ever had. And meanwhile, in 1965, Allen Ginsberg came to London, and without going into the whole story, he finished up coming to stay with me and my wife in the West End, because at that time I was managing a bookshop called Better Books on the Charing Cross Road, and he needed a sort of headquarters, so he used the bookshop as his headquarters, and he was staying with us. And it was through that we put on the big Albert Hall poetry reading in '65. And Alan, though, was another guru, I suppose, to me at the time, because again, I was still, by then I must have been 21 or something, and or 22. He, again, and by then I'd read all the Beat books, all the Kerouac and everything, and so just to have this guy sitting in my living room telling all these stories about Neil Cassidy and Burroughs and his whole life of the Beat generation was fantastic. And to me, I mean, that early exposure to the two of them, because I met Burroughs in '65 originally, it's affected my life from then on. I mean, to me, most of the ideas of the 60s counterculture and youth movement and whatever you want to call it come from the Beats, and particularly from them, actually. Them and their associates. It wasn't, it wasn't too much of an individual thing. I mean, most of the philosophies were held by a number of people and grew out of shared experience before my time. So when I went to art college, for instance, in '59, you'd look back, and the only place you could find role models was sort of the artist starving in a garret in Paris in the 20s or something, and the only other people around doing anything were the Beats. But at that point, nothing was published in England. Not a single one of them was published. So it was all mysterious and foreign and other, and something that one very much was very attractive, very appealing. And I wanted to be that, I wanted to be a Beat. I wanted to know all about them and meet them and find out all, and it was sounding good, drugs, free love, fantastic. So yeah, and they became friends, and I've worked with them all very closely. I compiled the annotated edition of Howl, and I compiled the annotated edition of Naked Lunch, which are two of the main texts.
The manuscript of Howl.
Yes.
That's the best.
No,
the actual reproduction of the manuscript.
Yes, we identified.
Very important.
I found the missing page. In fact, there was one missing page to that. And then later on, when I was working with Burroughs, I actually found two of his books. I found Queer, which at that point was in a pile. When I was cataloguing his manuscripts, he had a pile of papers, literally about that high, tied up in bale string, rough, thick string. And on the top, written in black magic marker, it said, bottom of the barrel. And so these were like just totally discarded manuscripts. So I went through there and I separated them out by paper size, by typeface, and in the end there were all these different categories of piles of paper. And there was one pile that had a sequential numbering on it. And in the end I completely, I got the original manuscript of Queer.
His first book.
And his first book, which he denied in some interviews that it ever existed, and he said, that was just a working title for something else.
It's that guy Lee who wrote that, not me.
But actually, there it was Queer, and then years later, in '88 or whatever it was published, of course, as part of a multi-book deal. And then the other one I found was Interzone, which, when I was researching my Allen Ginsberg biography in New York in '84, I guess '85, I was going through Columbia University Butler Library, Rare Book Library's index cards of the correspondence, and there was a letter from Burroughs to Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and it was not necessarily something to do with Ginsberg, but I thought, it says here, there was an E on the bottom of the card which suggested there was an enclosure. So I wondered what that is, so called it up. The enclosure was the complete manuscript of Interzone. Which is the very early draft of Naked Lunch.
I think that they were attracted to Paris for that same reason, as a space where they could think and live freely, and perhaps one day publish. But anyway...
it was very much Ginsberg who led them to...
Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Oh yeah, very much. No, I agree very much with what you're saying.
He had to come to Paris to write Kaddish, where he started writing the first draft at the Select in Montparnasse. Why? Because he had to put the Atlantic between him and Naomi.
Yes.
He had to cut the umbilical cord, and this terrible oppression that she exerted upon him. He writes about in that masterpiece of a poem called Kaddish, and he could do it only in a sort of the protected space of the mythical Paris, Montparnasse, where all those Modigliani and Zaha and the surrealists the ghosts were floating around. And he sat down at the Select in Montparnasse and started writing. And you remember he writes that he's sobbing, he's crying, so emotional to get this extraordinary text out of his life, and it happened in this incredible space, which was not really France. It was not New York. It was not Moscow or Berlin or Tokyo or Lhasa. It was a place where Rimbaud had come to as a young man, really. And you said something very interesting the other day at Normal Sup, that Bill had told you that the days, the years that he spent in Paris were his most productive.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that?
Well, no, I mean, this is, when I was researching the book, I mean, I went through his he did keep a journal in the later years of his life, maybe the last 6 or 8 years, 10 years maybe. And not long before he died, one of the entries is he says, looking back, I feel that those years in Paris were the most productive and the most experimental and the most rewarding, you know, of my whole life. And because it was here he finished Naked Lunch, it was here he didn't discover the cut-up technique, but Brian Guyson did, and he worked closely with Guyson. They published Minutes to Go and The Exterminator from here. And then he wrote all the cut-up novels. He also experimented with tape recorder mutations and cut-ups.
Right here in Paris, on the Grundig tape recorder.
Yeah,
that's
and
in
also,
the Balch movie. You see the actual
yes,
tape recorder.
that's it. It's right there.
It's the hero of the movie and the books.
And also films. I mean, there's a lot of the cut-ups and Trials Out of Fire was filmed here. But also working with Guyson, he did a lot of experiments with sort of crystal gazing, and you know, they would stare into crystal balls and have visions, and I mean, just all kinds of weird experimentation was going on. He did a whole series of experiments with invisibility, for instance, which I wish I knew more about, because I do describe them a little bit in my book. But apparently at the Beat Hotel he would have evenings occasionally where he would sit behind some kind of Venetian blind, and he would be sort of sitting there, and there would be a picture of him projected onto him, which was exactly the same as him. And so you never knew really whether you were looking at him or a picture of him. And then the blind would be moved, and the camera would focus, the projector would focus sometimes on the blind and sometimes on him, and back and forth. And then at one point,
just like the Dream Machine.
And at one point, he would then sink down. You know, when it was focused on the blind, he would sink down behind and crawl away, and people kept on looking and thinking he was still there. And then suddenly it would go blank. You know, the blind would open and he was gone, and he had become invisible.
When you were saying that he noted down that this was the richest, most experimental period in his life, and probably the happiest times.
I think happiest, certainly most productive.
Most
in every
productive.
sense, actually.
Do you think that it might have something to do with the fact that they were all living together in the same hotel?
Yes.
That there was a sort of tribal, clanic atmosphere, and you used the term collaborative work there, and it's definitely all together. Mm-hmm. There's not a solitary thing, but a collective and collaborative way of not only of writing and creating, but of living.
Yeah.
And if you look again at the wider picture, this happens very often in the history of humanity, that the most productively experimental and radical work of certain great poets or artists occurred when there were a group. Look at the Fauve paintings, for instance.
Yes.
The Fauve painters. They were definitely, for a very short period of time, the Beat Hotel years were a short period, 2 or 3 years.
Yes, it was only 2 or 3 years. Really.
And the Fauve, the same thing, you know, 1905, 6, 7, maybe 4, a little bit. And all of them were painting this extraordinarily beautiful, violently new art. And then when the whole thing separated, only a few like Matisse and Braque became who they were after. The others became totally mediocre, like Van Dogen or Dufy, you know. And what held the whole thing together with this emulation, this common spirit, this what our friend Félix Guattari called agencement collectif d'énonciation, and impossible to translate. But anyway, a collective endeavor, a collaborative endeavor. And that's probably what William...
The group mind.
Right.
That's slightly different.
And that's probably what William was referring to as the best context for his work.
And he always worked best collaboratively. You know, he worked so closely with Brian Guyson, and then people like Ginsberg edited the Soft Machine pretty much into shape with Guyson. James Garholz put together much of the final trilogy, for instance.
And then the operas?
the opera that he worked on with
Yeah.
with Robert Wilson and
Phil Glass.
and yes, I mean he did need other people there. I mean, there's no question about that. Naked Lunch was basically put together from his correspondence with Ginsberg. I mean, and then Alan and Kerouac went down to Tangier and worked with him on it and put it all together.
And the title was by Kerouac.
Well, the title
Oh,
was
what?
actually the title was Ginsberg. It was in Tangier. Ginsberg was reading aloud from the manuscript of Queer, as a matter of fact, and there was a line there which said "naked lust," but Alan was reading Bill's handwriting and he misread it and he said "naked lunch," and Kerouac, who was there at the same time, said that would be a title for a book.
Great.
So it actually started off with Bill, but it was a misreading of Naked
It's like
Lunch.
the Jackson Pollock dripping. The mistake becomes the best thing
Yes,
in the
yeah,
painting.
Yeah.
Great.